Welcome everyone to this year's Peace History Conference, where we'll be looking at state surveillance and police infiltration of peace movements. We don't need a long introduction from me, but my name's Jackie Burke. I work for Greater Manchester District CND, and I'm one of the founder members of the Peace History Conference organising group. We obviously want to move on to our excellent panel of speakers today. However, I did just want to remind everyone, if you did know or if you didn't know, that today is the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. There are events happening all across the world to mark it, this one included. When I was thinking about that, I was looking back at some of the anti-nuclear campaigns I've been a part of from the 1980s onwards: Greenham, Aldermaston, Faslane, Nuke Watch, etc., etc. And all of them have faced some sort of sanction from government and police. The sanctions, some covert and some overt, facing those of us who campaign for peace, might change depending on the government of the day, or maybe even the public mood, with the media, social included, whipping up anti-protest feelings. But we campaigners are tenacious, creative, bold and brave, and will continue to store our mobile phones in metal buckets, switched off and in rooms far away from the planning meeting. So this webinar will be recorded and will be put on the GMD CND YouTube channel and our website. So please pass it on to anybody that you know that's not been able to join us today. There'll be a Q&A session at the end after we've heard from our speakers. So please add your questions to the Q&A and chat boxes. So we're going to start with a message from Jeremy Corbyn. So Andrew, if you would please put that on.
First of all, I'm very sorry I can't be with you this afternoon because I'm in Brighton addressing a number of meetings on environment and a very big rally against austerity and for an economic strategy that fundamentally improves people's lives. And also I'm doing meetings on international strategy and the opportunity that we all have now to turn the dial on international strategy away from wars of intervention and one towards disarmament, peace and justice. But there's also a need to examine what's done against the peace movement by the powerful forces in the world. Our voice of truth, our voice of reason, is attempting to be silenced by many of the media. But we've also had infiltration. This isn't new. There were police infiltrators amongst those who campaigned in the First World War, for the end of the First World War. There were infiltrators in the peace movement of the 1920s and 1930s. And there were also infiltrators into CND. We now know that. We now know that because of the inquiry that's going on into surveillance and policing operations into different organizations, how they infiltrated, how they became agents provocateurs, how they made odd and often ludicrous demands in order to try to divide movements that were fundamentally united on what their achievement was going to be. And so having this discussion about infiltration is very important. I've been following the inquiry into police surveillance because my name crops up many times, as does that of many other colleagues, friends and comrades. And so having this debate and this discussion is very important. We don't need to be diverted away from what is our fundamental message. We want a world of peace. We oppose the holding of nuclear weapons. We support the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We're appalled that the warheads on one British Trident submarine, as we have now, if all fired off, would be greater than the entirety of all the bombs in all theatres of war between 1939 and 1945. It doesn't bring peace. It doesn't make us secure. It actually increases the danger around the world. So our peace movement needs to be strong, needs to communicate with each other, and needs to be able to trust each other. Because those that want to see more arms, that fundamentally want to see more wars of intervention, are very nervous, indeed probably very frightened of the power of that simple message of peace and disarmament. That's what you'll be doing today in Manchester. It's what we'll be doing here in Brighton. There's a number of events that we've got. And it's what we're going to be doing as we now challenge the whole interventionist narrative that has driven so much of international politics for the past 20 years. Let's change the dial, change course, and be the focus and the force and the momentum for peace. Thank you very much for all that you all do.
Thank you. Thank you. So now we're going to move on to our first speaker, our first live speaker. That's Dr. Ali Ronan. Dr. Ronan, Ali, is a feminist historian interested in recovering hidden histories, particularly relating to World War I. She's a visiting research fellow at Manchester Metropolitan University. Over to you, Ali.
Hello. Well, that was very inspiring, and thank you, Jeremy Corbyn, for starting off the Peace Conference. Following on from that, I really wanted to introduce you to a couple of what I might call ordinary agitators and activists from the First World War and into the 1950s and 60s, Phyllis and Alan Skinner. Phyllis Skinner was one of the editors of the No Conscription Fellowship Journal in Manchester during the First World War. And I love this headline that she wrote, which is, "It is our duty clamorously and unceasingly to agitate." And what we know, what I've just discovered really through the lockdown, is that these two were under surveillance from 1917 until the middle of the Second World War. And that's really what I want to share with you today. If people are interested, the archive reference is KV2 /684-685. And there's my email if anyone wants to contact me and have a discussion about it, which I'd love. Okay. So I'm talking about Phyllis and Alan Skinner. I only have a photo of Alan. I'm unable to find a picture of Phyllis Skinner, which if anyone's got one, that would really make my day. So the brief history of them is that they got married in 1912. She was a lot older than him, 16 years. She lied continuously about her age. They were both from London, but they moved to Manchester, presumably because Phyllis married him after being divorced, and that was probably quite a hard thing at that time. They were in the ILP, they're pacifists and they're internationalists. And in 1916, Alan Skinner was arrested and sent to jail as a conscientious objector. These are some pictures of No Conscription Fellowship from Manchester. The No Conscription Fellowship was an enormous network of people across the country set up by Fenner Brockway, that some of you will have heard of, and his wife in 1914. And it really built on some of the networks that had been built through the suffrage and socialist campaigns before the war. This is a copy of the No Conscription Fellowship Journal, which is a kind of lovely Romeo thing. Those of us who are a bit older will remember those. As Jeremy Corbyn said, the peace movement in Manchester and all across the country during the war was under surveillance. And people knew that. People would write to each other and say that there'd been detectives in the crowd. People would recognize them on the street. The surveillance at that time was really quite overt. And of course, in general meetings, the police were there combing out men who had not enlisted. So people were very aware of being watched. In 1917, Phyllis Skinner and her friend Maud, this is her friend Maud Hayes, went to a training camp in Cheshire to hand out leaflets to the troops that were stationed there. And for that, they were arrested and sentenced to 6 months in Strangeways prison. And questions were asked in the House of Commons by a Quaker MP about whether it was actually against the law to voice an opinion about war. So this became known as the Peace Crusade case. The Peace Crusade was an enormous and largely unrecorded series of demonstrations across England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland in 1917 asking really for a negotiated peace and agitating against the war. In 1919, conscientious objectors were released from prison, and the Skinners moved to London. No conscription fellowship at that time closed down, and it reinvented itself as the No More War movement in 1921. And it was really that anniversary that sparked my interest in doing this paper for you today, because it is 100 years since the No More War movement established itself. And of course, it really had within its ranks all the people who'd been involved in the No Conscription Fellowship. So there were a lot of overlaps in that. And the chair was Fenner Brockway. So at that time, we can see from the surveillance papers that people were, the police and MI5 were infiltrating the meetings. They were taking notes about who was being elected onto committees and things like that. And I think that people would have known that that was happening, although I have no other evidence to support that. But people were absolutely used to being under surveillance at that time. Alan Skinner was also involved in something called the Meru conspiracy case. The papers about this are at the Working Class Movement Library in Manchester. And this was a case that really, I think, demonstrates the internationalism of a lot of these pacifists and socialists at this time. It was about trade unionists in India who'd been wrongly arrested. And it was quite a celebrated cause at that time. But clearly, it was under surveillance and people were being watched. Alan Skinner was on the committee for this, and there were other people from Manchester like Ellen Wilkinson and Harry Pollitt, both of whom by this time were in the Communist Party, or perhaps had left the Communist Party, but had those contacts. Alan Skinner was also very, very involved in the ILP. And during the late 1920s and early 1930s, he was instrumental in the split from the main Labour Party, the ILP seeing itself as much more revolutionary. And there are lots and lots of papers about the infiltration of this particular period of time when the MI5 and the police were being very interested in who was on the committees and whatever. And also, I think we have to remember that at the beginning of this time in the 1930s, the second war is on the horizon. People know, you begin to, things are talking about peace. People are beginning to mobilize again around what they will do about conscription and things like that. The police were also interested in something called the Pacifist Research Bureau, and this is something that seems to have published quite a lot of theoretical things about peace, and was very clearly international, had lots of links with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which had been set up in the First War, and it brought together, again, people from the left and from the old conscientious objector movement in the First War, people like Harold Bing and Wilfred Wellock. What's interesting, I think, is that a lot of the people that had been involved in the No Conscription Fellowship and the early pacifist movement in the war, by this time had become involved in mainstream politics, and many of them were MPs. So Wilfred Wellock, Fenner Brockway, George Lansbury, etc., are involved in mainstream politics by this time. In 1934, Alan was involved in the setting up of the Peace Pledge Union, and there's quite a lot of papers looking at who was involved in that and how that was going forward. The Peace Pledge Union, although I do love pacifists, was exclusively male for the first 2 years, and I wonder whether Phyllis, who I'm not mentioning very much, but she's very clearly on the sidelines here, writing, we discover from infiltration papers, she's quite clearly writing Alan's speeches and things like this So I wonder if she had something to do with the fact that in 1936 the Peace Pledge Unionists opened up to women as well. Alan Skinner was always writing. He was editing papers from the GPO. He was a postman and very involved with the union. He was involved in editing journals from the No More War movement, which sort of morphed into the War Resisters International and the Peace Pledge Union in the 30s. He was also one of the editors in the 1950s of Peace News. In the 1940s, Phyllis and Alan Skinner bought this cottage in Cornwall. Not sure how they had the money, but I think it cost £100, which is quite a lot of money in those days. And you can see here that this cottage is under surveillance. This is the paper from to the local police. The cottage was bought for conscientious objectors to retreat to as a kind of haven for them. And we know that there was a burgeoning kind of pacifist movement in the Southwest, and that papers like Peace News and Peace Pledge Union leaflets and things were delivered to this cottage and were under surveillance. I went to see it this year, which is why I've got this little picture. It's on a very tiny little road, so they must have been very aware of the detectives, unless I don't know quite how they, whether they hid behind a bush or something, but I'm not quite sure, but there they are. Phyllis died in 1950, and certainly the papers, the surveillance papers, seem to finish in about 1938 or 1944, something like that. And I was just saying earlier that I think it's quite possible that the surveillance then became much more targeted at organisations. Alan Skinner was involved in the Direct Action Committee, which is a kind of forerunner of CND, and he was very involved in the Aldermaster marches and things like that. In 1960, when he was 70, he was arrested for demonstrating outside a missile base for the Thor missiles, and spent his 70th birthday in prison. This is the only other picture I have of Alan. You can see here, it's an undated photograph. There are people like Edmund Hughes, the MP, and Michael Randall, it says on the back of the photo. And I think he must there be talking in some capacity as editor or something of Peace News. Alan Skinner died in 1974. And really, it's quite hard to find out anything more about them. They seem to me to be people who were on the edges of things. So they're on committees, but they're not remembered in that kind of way. And I really wanted to introduce them to you because it seems to me that there are a lot of people like the Skinners, myself included, who are on the edges and possibly will just disappear in the midst of time. But it's important, I think, to remember, as Phyllis said, that it is our duty to clamorously and unceasingly to agitate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. What an interesting start. That's great. Thank you ever so much. And as I said, please put your questions. People have started to put questions in the Q&A box, so please do, and we'll get to those when we've listened to the rest of our speakers, our other speakers. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce Rob Evans. He's an investigative reporter at The Guardian, and he co-authored the book Undercover, the true story of Britain's secret police, and he also blogs on the subject, and I'm sure he'll tell us about the work that he's been doing and the pieces that have been in The Guardian recently. So thank you, Rob.
Thank you, and also thank you for inviting me. I know that the surveillance of peace groups and left-wing groups has been going on for many years, decades. What I'm going to just briefly talk about is an operation that started in 1968, when the police and with the backing of MI5 started to use undercover police officers to spy on political groups, which was, I think, a particularly intrusive tactic, and they entered into this with, you know, a lot of effort, basically, because they would get police officers and give them a new identity, and they would give the police officers, you know, the spies would be given documentation to back up their new identities, their fake identities, and they would go and live the life of an actor. They would infiltrate groups and live the life of a, you know, political activist for periods of 4 to 5 years, or even longer, actually, in some cases. So it's a very elaborate preparation that they undertook, and it's a very sort of sophisticated technique that they're using. And what's happened is that they started using undercover officers in this particular operation in 1968, at a time when there was a lot of, you know, political agitation going on. The establishment felt under threat, and basically they wanted to know in more detail what progressive groups were doing and what they were up to. So they started sending undercover officers into political groups over a long period of time, and they would be there basically to collect information and pass it back in detailed reports to their supervisors, and the police would decide what to do. And they would also be passing this information directly to MI5. And we know that this operation started in 1968 and went on to at least 2000. Well, we don't know when it ended, essentially, but we do know that there are 139 police officers, undercover officers in that time, and that they spied on more than 1,000 political groups, mainly, overwhelmingly, progressive left-wing groups. And CND were one of the groups that were spied on. We know that when the undercover officers are, you know, during their deployment, they would be gathering information on a wide range, on anything they saw, really, and they would pass it back. And you would have undercover officers in the 70s who would be, for example, gathering information on the Torness campaigns about Torness nuclear power station. In the 1980s, of course, CND was mounting a very big challenge to the government over nuclear weapons policy, cruise missiles, and the surveillance was stepped up at that time. And I think there was very deep, you know, very widespread surveillance by the state of CND during the 80s. And we know, for example, that there was an undercover officer placed inside CND headquarters by the name of John. He used the fake name of John Kerry, but he was there for 3 years between 1981 and 1984. And we also know that there was an undercover officer who used the fake name of Timothy Spence, and he was undercover in East London in the, you know, Hackney CND, that type of local group. And whenever all these undercover officers, you know, they feed back, they go to a meeting and they record what was happening at that meeting, who they recognized, and they would send back very detailed reports of that meeting and anything else they were picking up, leaflets, you know, meeting addresses, people's addresses, they would record and send back. So, you know, this is no light undertaking, I think. And we also know that in the early 80s, they had the police put in an undercover officer into Greenham Common. Her fake name, was Catherine Lee Bonser. And she was also actually as part of her deployment, she also spied on again, a small group in South London called, I think it was called Lambert Women for Peace. And so again, it sort of emphasizes that, these are small groups which are being small local groups which are being spied on. And we also know that the surveillance is carried on. We know that there was an undercover officer called Lynn Watson, and she spied on the Aldermaston Women's Peace Group in the 2000s. And we also know that there was a so far unidentified undercover officer who spied on a group called Faslane 365, which mounted a continuous protest of outside Faslane between 2006 and 2007. So what has happened in recent? I mean, this was the undercover operation went on for years and years. I mean, it was started in 1968, but it only really came to light in 2010. So it is an operation carried out in deep secrecy, which the state could carry out without anyone really knowing what was going on. But since 2010, things have started to tumble out, and the public have begun to learn what these undercover officers were doing. And part of this has come about because of their misconduct. And it's been revealed, for example, that the undercover officers stole the identities of dead babies, dead children, in order to use as their own identity when they went undercover. They were also, many of them were deceiving women into very long-term relationships, without the women knowing, and in some cases actually fathering children with them. And that we also know that they were spying on families, bereaved families, who were actually fighting against the police to find out, the truth and justice of what had happened to their relatives. And we know, for example, that the undercover officers spied on the family of Stephen Lawrence when they were trying to persuade the police to investigate the racist murder of their son properly. The police were spying on them. And so all of these revelations have helped to A, tell the public what's going on, but B, force the government to actually initiate a public inquiry, which is a slow-moving beast, it must be said, which is looking in more detail at what the whole operation was doing, why they were doing it, what was the misconduct. And the one thing that I'll just end, but I do think that one thing that people who think they were, one thing that has been very clear about throughout this whole time in the last decade, when the revelations have come out, is that many of the revelations have come to light because of the detective work of the activists who were spied on, the women who were deceived. They are the ones who, they often go away and find out what's been going on, and they uncover the truth. And this has been a very powerful factor in uncovering the truth. And one thing that activists can do is, look out to see who the names of these people who have infiltrated them, and sort of help to piece together what they were up to. Because at the public inquiry, the police come forward with their version of what's happened, but often, they are lying, basically, if I put it bluntly, or they tell a half-truth. So it's very important that, the people who were the targets of the investigation, of this surveillance, actually come forward and say, no, that's not what happened, this happened. So I'm happy to, I wrote an article about the infiltration of CND a few weeks ago with more detail, I hope, about that infiltration. But, people are, the lawyers and the groups who were under investigation and CND are trying to find out more about this. So if anyone does know anything more, it'd be useful if you could come forward.
Thank you. Yes, if you want to know more about that, have a look at, please go to CND's website. There's some information on there and you can follow the links. Thank you ever so much, Rob. Thank you very much. We're now going to see a film clip from Spycops, which was made by Black Helmet Productions. Is that right, Jason? And Jason Kirkpatrick, our next speaker, will speak after that. Did I get that right, Jason?
Yes, I've been working on this with a great producer named Justin Jones. He's the one that's done most of the work on this clip lately, but I've been working on this film for 10 years. I'm glad to be able to show it to everyone here.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Andrew. Thank you. I'd like to introduce you to Jason Kirkpatrick, who's our next speaker. He's an activist and a film director. He's the co-producer of Spycops that you've just seen a clip from, which is would you describe it as a documentary about your former friend,
Yes.
Mark Kennedy?
Yes, well, former friend. It's hard to spit that word out of my mouth. He was my friend for 5 years, yes, Mark Kennedy. In that clip, for those of you that saw this live, Kate Wilson and Sarah Hampton were two women that were tricked, deceived into intimate relations with him. They're friends of mine that I've known for 15 or going on 20 years. And I've been working on this film since I found out that Mark was an undercover cop. In the last year, I've been working closely with Justin Jones at Small World, and he has been putting in a ton of time this year, as well as me, for 10 years. And we're looking for ways to finish up this film and find a good TV slot or something for it. If people have ideas, please get in touch with me. Most recently, this film's been using the name Spycops, but I used the name Spied Upon for 10 years before. I do have a website, spiedupon.com, and people can contact me there if they want. So the stories are shocking. There's something new every time there's a hearing. Rob Evans writes about it. I think almost everybody in this clip, Rob Evans has written a story about, so you can also see more at The Guardian. I've been asked to talk about the human cost of being spied on. I think especially these women, a lot of these victims were women. They do a really good job in this clip of describing that, but I can tell you a bit about my experience. I was targeted by Mark Kennedy for 5 years. I'm originally from the USA, as you can probably hear from my accent. I lived in the UK for a couple of years after that, also where I met Mark, and now I'm in Berlin, Germany, where I've lived for about 18 years. And on a very personal level, I can tell you, I have woken up having nightmares and dreams where in my dream, either a good friend of mine or my partner next to me stares at me in my dream and says, "I'm an undercover cop," and I wake up in a sweat. And this story, it didn't interfere with my personal space as much as it did these women. So virtually every woman that was tricked into an intimate relationship has received a massive payout by the Metropolitan Police, but they've been forced to all sign documents saying they're not able to disclose, which I find is just despicable. It's despicable by the police. It's despicable by the police chief that takes responsibility for this. And unfortunately, the politicians, in the end, they're the ones that should be controlling the police. But let me take a step back. So, as I mentioned, I'm from the US, and we found out through the case of Mark Kennedy, because a lot has been exposed, and Mark Kennedy actually testified at the UK Home Affairs Select Committee that he worked for the FBI, and he was under contract working for the FBI. When his real passport was found, he had a work permit for the USA. And he mentions working under contract for the FBI. He mentions that after he was an undercover police officer, he worked for a private consulting group based in the USA called the Densas Group. He did, apparently, according to him, he did consulting or gave information to the Los Angeles County Sheriff. I really wonder what kind of information. I'm originally from Los Angeles, although I haven't lived there for 20 years, so I really wonder what the hell was going on. But this personal level is amazing. So I want to talk about the FBI too, because We also found out through questions, parliamentary questions that were asked in Germany about Mark Kennedy's operations in Germany. Why was Mark Kennedy in Germany? Mark Kennedy targeted me first in Dublin in Ireland, where I met him, and Sarah Hampton from that clip, she met him also in the Republic of Ireland. I traveled with Mark Kennedy to Northern Ireland. I traveled with him and stayed in his home in the UK and England. I was with him in Scotland during the G8 protests, where I was doing media work, writing press releases, doing legal things. And these things should be protected. Journalists' work should be protected, but Mark Kennedy was targeting me at this time, coming into my office where I was writing press releases. Then when I moved to Germany, Mark Kennedy contacted me and said, oh, you live in Germany, actually. You've got a G8 summit protest coming in 2007. I think as British activists have a lot to learn from you German activists. Can I come and visit you in Berlin? I told my friend, I thought he was my friend, sure. Now I found out that actually the German police had a contract with him, and through the police that Mark Kennedy was working for. And I've been to Parliament dozens of times. I've visited MPs in London to talk about this, including the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, people in the policing committees, the Interior Committee in Germany. I've been there. I've talked to members of Parliament in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and in Dublin. And how this affects me personally is that I've fought virtually every single day since this story came out 10 years ago to try to find the truth. And the police in London have done everything they can with their very expensive lawyers to block access. I can't get my police file. 10 years later, this is 7 years now since Theresa May said in 2014 that this scandal requires an inquiry. The inquiry started in 2015. I applied to be a core participant, the Undercover policing inquiry. I'm a core participant, so something like an official witness, you probably know, as have, I think, most of the people in that clip we showed, Peter Hain, the other protagonists, they are core participants. I met Jeremy Corbyn at a press conference once and asked him, what about your police file? He told me, I'm going to try and get my police file. As far as I know, Jeremy Corbyn has not been able to get his police file. This is absurd. And the situation I'm in now is that luckily the British state has paid for a lawyer for me, who also represents about 60 of us, because they do everything they can to cut our access to justice, really. That's the truth. Everything they do, they don't pay for us to attend the hearings. They do broadcast them live on the internet so that their staff can see them, but it's not put online. The technology for, I think it's the Greenfell inquiry, almost every other inquiry going is broadcast live online, but not this one. Why is that? This inquiry has spent over 50 million, but they don't want us to get to the truth. So along parallel to the British inquiry, which covers only England and Wales, I've started legal cases in Northern Ireland. I work to start one in Scotland and in Germany. And luckily for me, lucky in a way, I do have cases still pending in Northern Ireland and in Germany. In fact, I got a date for my court date in last January in Germany before COVID made a delay. So I'm still waiting for it. And in Germany, the case I have against the German police is to declare Mark Kennedy's operations in Germany targeting me as unconstitutional. And there is a very good chance that that might happen. With my legal case in Northern Ireland, which is still progressing, we've called for a judicial review because we say that it's not fair that Mark Kennedy and many of these other undercover police, they targeted activists in England and Wales, and there's a public inquiry about that. But in my case, Mark Kennedy basically crossed the border with me into Northern Ireland, which it is part of the UK still, but they're not looking at that. And we say that's unfair. And since then, we found out that it's not only Mark Kennedy who was in Northern Ireland, but a number of other spy cops from these units were targeting people like the Member of Parliament, Bernadette Devlin, the late 60s, early 70s, or Eamon McCann from Northern Ireland. And they were watching the Civil Rights Association, which planned the Bloody Sunday event. So a number of years ago, David Cameron said, okay, it's the end of the Bloody Sunday inquiry. Every secret that Britain has now been placed on the table. Well, that wasn't true. And we found this out through documents released at the undercover policing inquiry in the last year. But they didn't bother telling the people in Northern Ireland who were spied upon that they were spied upon, and also that they could actually apply to be core participants at the undercover policing inquiry. All that was hidden. And they're not offering compensation costs. So in terms of how has this affected me? In terms of every single day this week, what I've had to do is go and raise money for these lawyers, because the state, the British state, is paying millions. They've been paying millions to police lawyers to try and block all the progress that we are trying to get out of this inquiry in London. And the British state, including the Northern Irish government and the police, they've blocked every effort for us to get access to justice in Northern Ireland. I have to raise money for the lawyers. In Northern Ireland, in Germany, sorry, I've gotten to see little bits of my police file, but I had to sign a statement saying, if I get bits of my police file that Mark Kennedy wrote, notes or whatever it is, I had to sign a document saying that I won't tell anyone, including my lawyers, under penalty that I can go to prison and they can confiscate all of my property. That's for my police file about me, written by a police officer that broke up this whole scandal. And the British state has had to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds out to these women because it's wrong. Theresa May said it's wrong. Boris Johnson had said when he was the mayor of London, this is wrong in the London City Council. So the personal toll that this takes is huge. And at every step, the police continue to block it. I can just go on. I'm getting riled up, you can see. Maybe I'm happy to leave some time for questions if there is time. So I think I can leave it there. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Yeah, no, it is incredibly moving. We've got we're going to have some time for questions. So we have had some in the Q&A box. And one from Rona wanted to talk about Ellen Wilkinson. So maybe this is one for you, Ali. So Ellen supported the more conservative Herbert Morrison for Labour Party leader against Clement Attlee. Morrison is Peter Mandelson's grandfather. And what do you believe might have been the factors that led her towards a more centrist support?
Oh, thanks, Rona. The answer really is I don't know. Of course, there is all kinds of speculation about her relationship with Morrison, I think. Am I right? And I really don't know. I'm not I know it sounds awful. Historians always say that not quite my period, but I guess it may be about her ambition. That sounds a terrible thing to say, but I think she, you know, certainly the women in Manchester who knew her through suffrage and socialism were very aware of her ambition, which is great. So it may have been something about the way she saw the trajectory of her political life going. I don't know. I don't know. Anybody else on the panel? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There's a very good book by Laura Beers, Beers, called Red Ellen, a biography of Ellen Wilkinson. So it might be worth looking there. Laura may have much more idea than I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. And another question has been, Rob's been answering your questions, but I'll put it out to everybody. So Anne would like to know from any of the panelists, maybe Rob and Jason, this is for one of you, any evidence of surveillance of right-wing groups? I was sort of thinking no, but I would not be at all surprised. So, Rob, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry. I answered in the Q&A. I didn't know if I should have done that, but anyway, yes. I mean, if you look at, I mean, the answer is not many. Far right groups were put under surveillance. Some were, but very few really. I mean, if you sort of if you look at we know that there are 1,000 groups that were spied on by the undercover officers, you know, from 1968 going on the next 4 decades. But if you look down the list, very few of them are far right groups. And for the first time the undercover officers were put into any far right group, I think, is in the 1980s. So that's like, you know, 10, 15 years after the operation has started out. Do they sort of think, oh, perhaps we ought to be doing that? You know, and this is a time, so from the 70s, that's a time when there's enormous sort of, you know, attacks, racist attacks by right-wing groups. And the police just don't think that, you could see this at the public inquiry. They're asked, you know, at a time in this, they're asked, you know, why didn't you think to put in undercover officers into right-wing groups? And it's just not really crossed their minds. So that we don't see very much about the infiltration of far-right groups, but essentially it's far less than left-wing groups and progressive groups.
Jason, did you want to come in on that?
Please. I'm also sharing a link. I'm sharing a link in the chat. So there have been a number of questions, parliamentary questions asked in Germany that kind of open up this whole situation in Europe. And I've shared a link about secretive European police working group that wasn't known until Mark Kennedy's thing came out. So when it was revealed that Kennedy was in Germany, members of parliament said, well, how was this regulated? They were just curious, you know, how was Mark Kennedy paid? How are these British cops paid when they come? And it turns out that there's been a group that was secret until the time called the European Undercover Group on, the European Group on, there's quite a few of these, but a European Cooperation Group on Undercover Activities. The link from a State Watch article is in the chat. And how it works with this exchange is that when someone goes abroad like Kennedy, the German police pay that person at that wage. And so we've also found out that all European police agencies, and often including USA or police from Israel or Ukraine, they meet once a year and they talk about how they're going to target groups. And so it's fair to say, well, let's not only look at Britain in isolation, but what's going on with the rest of them. In Germany, this is the same as we see in Britain. Like Rob said, almost no undercover police operations have targeted right-wing groups. This is the same in Germany. You may have heard of this with the neo-Nazi terror group called NSU. We saw this in the USA last year when there was, or early this year, January 6th, when these right-wing groups stormed the Capitol. The FBI admitted, oh, that's been a blind spot for us. They have been targeting left-wing groups. And it's like this all across Europe. So it's not it's not a one-off here. And we have to look at this historically. That's just the way it is. So what are we going to do about it? That's the next question. And I forgot to mention that while this frustrates me to no end on a personal level, I do have to say that I take it as a compliment that I was targeted for so long. For me and a lot of my friends, it means we were doing the right thing. We were on the right path and we were doing good work. And in my case, I think most of what I was doing was writing press releases, giving public speeches, starting press groups, being a good organizer, getting things done, setting clear goals and reaching them. That's what all of us try to do. Unfortunately, when we do it, a lot of times the state doesn't want to stop, wants to stop us. I wanted to also say thanks to the CND for inviting me. I didn't mention that my background is also having a lot to do with nuclear disarmament. My first activism was in the USA, going to the Nevada test site to protest against nuclear bombs there. And that's to a large degree a success. That Nevada nuclear test site has not been used in decades. So it was a group that was also targeted by the police. And I think, we just keep fighting. We set our goals and we organize like hell to achieve them. And I'm damn proud of the work I've done. And if a couple of undercover cops get in my way a little bit, it doesn't really matter. I'm sticking to my goals and I'm going to achieve them.
Hurrah, hurrah. I should actually say that the Peace History Group, which is a small coalition, is CND, but it's also the most incredible working class movement library as well. We all work together, and a couple of very nice local historians such as Ali is also a member of the organising group. I think one of the other questions, which is a nice sort of move on from this, is there a list of all the false names used by police officers? And following on from that, do we now know who all of the undercover cops were or are? I'm assuming not, but Rob, do you want to come in and then perhaps?
Sorry. Sorry, on the first question, do we know who all the undercover officers were? The short answer is no. There are about 139 of them, and we know, I think, about half of them. They're fake names, and I can circulate, if I can work the technology, 3 links which sort of give us quite a good list of those undercover officers that we know of. Briefly, we know some of the names of their real names, mainly because they were exposed by activists, so there was no choice. But essentially what's happened there a lot is that the police have fought very hard to keep secret names, that the names of undercover officers, but they have been challenged about this. So but what we do know is there's quite a lot of them have been named, and I'll circulate that on the chat.
Jason, would you like to say something about that? No, that's fine. Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Ali, would you, one thing that was that sort of came up in your talk was the research that you've done and which papers were available. And would it be ironically right to say that some of this information wouldn't necessarily have been available if it hadn't have been for the surveillance papers? As I say, ironically.
No, I don't think so. I think the information is available. What's interesting is that people are being watched. So actually, I knew, because actually I'm kind of going along with the 20s and 30s and learning about it, I think you could find out all that information anyway. But of course, as Rob said, what they were doing was going to meetings and getting people's names and addresses. So you probably couldn't find that out, though you may be able to. I think for me, what's interesting is that certainly in the beginning, in the First World War, people absolutely knew who the infiltrators were. So they would say at the beginning of a meeting, they would actually say hello to the detective. Hello, how are you? I mean, it's quite amusing in a way. But then they would say to people, be careful of what you say. They're being very open about it. So it's a kind of, that may be why they decided to become much more undercover. So, I have letters where people would say, we saw the detective at the end of the road. They don't quite invite them in for a cup of tea, but you do feel that they were absolutely aware of what was going on. It clearly becomes much more sophisticated as the time goes on. And I guess, yeah, there might be some things there. For instance, there is a report about Phyllis and Alan's flat in London, which describes what it's like, rather like the woman was saying in the Spycops film. It talks about the books on the bookshelves, the kind of ambience of the flat, in a way that you wouldn't be able to get from without that kind of surveillance. But I guess that Phyllis and Alan didn't know that that person was an infiltrator. So I think it becomes more sophisticated until you get to the place like 1968, where they really are completely unknowable. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was rather long-winded.
No. That's absolutely fine. I absolutely love the idea of them being outed, and they were probably absolutely fine with being outed.
Yeah,
everybody knew why they were there, but they were still there to collect.
I mean, there is a very famous case which I probably would have to really think about, but the Alice Wielden case that people may know about in the First World War, where Alice Wielden's was part of the No Conscription Fellowship and the ILP, and they were being infiltrated in Derbyshire, and she was accused of a plot against Lloyd George and was put in prison for a long time. And that man was working with an alias. So I think it would be very interesting to do a lot more work about, even though these people were known, whether they were still working with aliases and that kind of thing. But the Alice Wielden case, Sheila Rowbottom has written a very good book and a play about that, if people are interested. So, yeah. And people are, at the moment, working to get Alice Wielden, I don't know what the word is, not pardoned. What is, yes, but pardoned in post-mortem, yeah. So.
Thank you. Rob, another question is there anything in the records to suggest why these smaller groups were being infiltrated, these smaller local groups? Was there any sense? Well, we know there's no sense behind it. Was there any sense behind it?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that happens is that, I mean, it's difficult to generalize, but just, for example, I think one thing that is going on, for example, is that, you know, if you're an undercover officer and you're just beginning at your deployment, and you've got, you know, 4 years in front of you, what they have to do is to start to build up their fake identity and their legend. You know, that's what they call it, the legend. So they often start in the local group, really, just to sort of, you know, get a feel for what, you know, what they're going to be doing. But two, to start getting their name around. And it's quite a good, I mean, I remember Lynn Watson, for example, she went undercover in the early 2000s, you know, and she started in a local group down in Worthing, which was protesting about the destruction of a wood, you know, and so she can just, one thing that they're doing there, I think, is that they've got a target, but you can't just walk into that target group, as it were. You've got to build from the outside. So I think they're just building up their experience of, you know, the movement that they're about to infiltrate, and so that when they go to another group, they can say, oh yeah, I was active in X group, and, you know, they begin to, and someone with there may say, oh yes, I saw them, you know, and they begin to, you know, they become part of the scene, as it were. But one thing that is clear is that these officers, when they're in their deployment, they are like hoovers. So they are hoovering up every bit of information they can, which they can send back to their superiors. And you can see, you know, if they were at a group, a local group, a meeting of a local group, they would send back a report of that, because the onus is on them and their bosses, their superiors, to justify their deployment. So they've got to immediately start, you know, from day one, they are sending back every, you know, information back to sort of say, hey, look, I'm useful. This is what I'm gathering. So they will, you know, go. So Timothy Spence, for example, we think he was a local activist in Hackney and we think that's Hackney CND, he would have had, you know, it's likely, we haven't seen the documents yet, but he would be sending back detailed reports of Hackney CND back to his superiors to say, this is what I'm doing, I'm very useful, the deployment should carry on. And his superiors could say, oh, we've got a source who says X, Y, and Z, you know. So the onus on them is, it's not like they turn up to a local group and start building their legend and don't report back anything. They are, from day one, they are, you know, they are feeding back information.
Jason, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just to add some things, you know, these are full-time undercover officers. So let's say they're getting paid for 40 hours of work. Often it's overtime at overtime pay built to the taxpayer, right? And a lot of cops, they want to get overtime, right? Sure, why not? And all the expenses, that's what Mark Kennedy got. We know all this now, it's all public, nothing's hidden. So if he wanted to go for a drive, I guess he would probably justify it that he wanted to go watch the local terrorist bird watching society or whatever and take a trip out to the field, whatever. But all of this is on the taxpayer, and other things that just make no sense. Like there are quite a few questions here. Were the right-wing movements targeted? No, they weren't really, although they kill people. And we don't hear about climate change groups today going out and killing people like the right-wing people do. Anyways, one of the things Mark Kennedy did when he came to visit me in Berlin is he asked me if I would go with him and his crew from England to go attack a neo-Nazi in Germany. We had never talked about this topic before. I didn't know where he was coming from. I thought maybe we'd been out for a pint. I don't know. I thought he was drinking or something. And I thought maybe I didn't understand him. And he explained to me here in Berlin, where I am today, that he had a crew of anti-fascist friends in England that would come over to Germany. And if I could give him a name of a neo-Nazi to attack, he would go with me and attack them. So I only guess he was trying to frame me for something or set me up or justify his existence. But justify his existence to who? To the German police? To the British police? I mean, as an American, I'm like you British folks, we were in a war with Nazi Germany. So why did the British police send this guy over to Germany to ask someone about attacking neo-Nazis? It makes no sense. Like, shouldn't the British police be concerned with neo-Nazi violence? I mean, they practically could have taken over the country in 1940, 41, right? I mean, you would think that there's a different type of common sense about these things. I don't know what these people are thinking. And for people listening, your police are doing this, you are paying for it, your MPs are authorizing this money to go to them. Get in touch with your MPs and find out what the hell is going on. I went to the city council in London and I asked people on the policing commission, can't you pull the budget, you know, threaten something with the budget? And I found out that the London Metropolitan Police have found a way to get their budgetary control away from the City of London. It's not controlled by the London City Council. Most people don't know that, and I was surprised because I'm actually a former vice mayor myself. I was elected as a vice mayor in California. We had a local police chief. I was in charge of the budget. When I had a problem with our police, I called the police chief and I said, hey, Mel, can we talk about this? But your London City councillors cannot talk to the police in the Met about what's going on. So please take care of your public money, watch where it's going.
Yes, Ali, would you like to come in?
I only want to say that the programme Vigil is quite interesting at the moment, which kind of seems to me, I have not watched it that carefully, but I think I will watch it again. It finishes tonight, but it seems to me to be blurring some of those things about policing and activism and who's friendly with who. I don't know what, you know. So that's on mainstream TV, isn't it? I don't know if people have watched it, but it's about nuclear submarine. So, you know, and it seems to me to be offering in a kind of media way, do you know, in that kind of, this is a common sense thing that police know this. I don't know. Have you watched it, Rob? You know, that kind of, it kind of normalizes that kind of relationship, I think. I don't know.
I did find it interesting actually, because it talked quite. I mean, part of the plot is a peace camp, which is obviously sort of Faz Lane, but they do talk about it being infiltrated by MI5, which I found quite interesting that they should do that. But I haven't seen the more recent episodes where I think it goes off into another, tangent. The plot goes off into another tangent. But anyway.
Thank you. We've got another question about who are the police actually acting for? Corporations, the military, and why on earth is the information about peace groups useful, other than to know about direct action that might impact obviously on local businesses or the military or military action? Who would like to?
Shall I talk?
Yes, Rob, that would be great. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't want to sort of dominate things. Two things, yes. I mean, what are the undercover officers doing? They are essentially there gathering information in order to pass back to their superiors in special branch. And what they're doing is twofold. One is to sort of gather information about upcoming protests, who's going to be doing what when. Is it going to be a big protest? What are they going to, what are the protesters doing? But secondly, they also want to get an idea about the group, this movement. Is it vibrant? Is it, is it growing? Is it, who are the main players? What's it likely to do? And they're passing that information back to, these are special branch units, because that's what special branch does. It monitors political groups who they consider to be a threat to the status quo. And this information is also being passed back to MI5, because that's their job as well. So what the state does is, of course, they want to keep an eye on political groups and what they're doing. And this is one source of information that they are using. And they're also using, other sources of information like informants. They have informants in groups. These are activists who are part of that group, who are then, for whatever reason, passing information to the police. And they use other sources such as phone tapping, or sometimes they'll just go on, sometimes they'll go along to a demonstration and just sort of record what's going on. And you can see, for example, after the big demonstrations in the 1980s, I can circulate a link on this actually. You can see that the big demonstrations in the 1980s that the CND was organising, and all the demonstrations actually that they were organising, the main ones, a special branch would have a very detailed report on that demonstration, and which they would cobbled together from all sorts of sources. Some of it was covert sources, but some of it was just, having a special branch officer literally sort of sitting down and just recording all the banners, the groups that turned up at a demonstration. And I've seen this. You see the list. Hackney CND, Greater Manchester CND turned up, and the name and the banners and the names, and what the slogans on the banners were as well, because they want to know what the groups are up to. And secondly, that of course the other part of that is that information is often supplied to corporations to either prepare those corporations for for protests, and it's difficult to get sight of that, but that is something that does go on quite regularly, I would think.
Thank you. Jason, have you got your hand up again? Yes, thank you. Do you want to come in?
Sure. Mark Kennedy's case study here is fantastic and provides us with a lot of information. He was undercover for 7 or 8 years, And one of the questions that has been asked in Ireland especially is, why was Mark Kennedy in Ireland so many times? Why was he spying on non-violent activists who were concerned about the Shell oil pipeline in the west of Scotland, west of Ireland, sorry, in County Mayo? And I just shared a link from the Irish Times because I was involved in trying to get an inquiry going in Ireland. So it turns out, and you can find lots of this online, that Shell Oil hired former police to be private security guards for Shell. They contacted their police networks to find ways to get rid of, intimidate the protest groups. We know that the Irish police have good connections to the British police. A lot of these police have retired in England and in Ireland and become private security guards. And then, like Rob said, it becomes this web. So these people are buddies and they hire their buddies, whether they're state police or private police, whatever is working best for them at the moment, that's what they do. We heard also a little bit of information come out. Rob might be able to add to this, but my understanding is that when Mark Kennedy was targeting, especially the climate movement around 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, there were a lot of protests at coal factories in the UK. Like everyone knows now, it's a big concern. So Mark Kennedy was targeting people who were against these coal companies, and the coal companies were quite concerned that they were going to have damage done to their reputations. So they wanted to get rid of these climate movements. Also, we've heard about big companies. I forgot if it's RWE or E.ON or which ones it was. I've forgotten. But they were wanting to invest billions in the UK in new power plants. But I heard stories that they lobbied the British government at the time saying, if you don't get rid of these climate activists, we're not going to invest billions here in new power plants. And they pressured the government to go send their minions. In this case, I would say Mark Kennedy is a little minion, a little guy in this big haystack, a little puppet, and get them to sabotage the climate movement. That's what they did. And once again, this is just fits into the pattern of how these things have worked forever.
Thank you. We've got two more questions, and then we're going to move on. One is that given Greater Manchester Police comes under the devolved mayor and has got major problems, does that make Greater Manchester more vulnerable to surveillance, etc.? I'm going to sort of jump in and say I don't know whether it makes Greater Manchester more vulnerable. Greater Manchester CND has had its fair share of infiltrators, and we're very, very active. I'm sure we're mentioned a lot in dispatches because we've we worked very closely with the Faslane 365. I think we were the one regional group that went up and blockaded more than any of the others. I think we were up there 3-4 times doing very successful blockades. So I'm sure that we get mentioned quite a lot, and if we weren't getting mentioned quite a lot, then we wouldn't be doing a good job, as has been said, as Jason said. I don't suppose, Rob, I don't know whether Rob or you, whether you'd have anything to say about that, whether it makes Greater Manchester more vulnerable to surveillance.
I'm not sure. All I know is that, Greater Manchester Police have a special branch, and one of their jobs would be to gather information about local groups. That's what they're required to do. So, but I don't know very much about, much more than that.
Thank you. And the final question is, as the special forces, the SDF, is it been closed down, the SDF, or is it still operating? And there's a comment about the fact that they spied on the Shrewsbury 6 and carried out some dirty tricks on them. So this is a question for Rob or Jason. So now they're moving on to the environment movement because they're processing as fossil fuel industry. Do we think they're being spied on more? Have we already answered that question? Jason, would you like to come in?
I don't have so much more to add. I would say they're definitely being targeted, and they will sink to no depths. They will Another thing that people also don't consider is the police have a very good PR department. They have very good PR and they use it. And us activists are, we're volunteer for the most part. We try to send out a press release. We try to get contacts, but at the same time, these oil companies, they have communications teams and they have lobbyists. There was something that came out on Channel 4, I think it was in July, about an Exxon lobbyist in the US. And he said that he has regular meetings with top US politicians to try to block things like the Green New Deal and infrastructure investment for climate. And you can expect that whatever Exxon is doing in the USA, they're doing the same in the UK. So we have to be vigilant. We have to be on the lookout. We have to be as smart as they are. And luckily, with this undercover policing inquiry, we can look and see exactly what kind of dirty tricks they've been using. And a lot of the ones that we see from the beginning of this inquiry in 1968 are the same types of things they're doing today. So we just have to bone up on our history, spend a little bit of time, and spend some time training and learning how to be effective activists, and we can continue to win.
Thank you. And I did say that was final, but one final, very small one. Anybody know the extent of Spycop involvement in blacklisting of workers, which I think is a really interesting one?
Yes, this is interesting. I mean, I don't know how much people have followed the story of the blacklisting of workers, but the big corporations funded secret lists to keep out from construction sites workers that they deemed to be troublesome or politically awkward, and basically this was exposed. And one thing that is sort of we see a bit of is, were the police helping the blacklisting operation? And the thing is it's a very covert area. It's very clandestine, very sort of furtive area. But you do see, snippets of this come out, and hopefully the inquiry will, something more about that may come out. And I mean, just following on from what Jason was saying, is that the one thing I do think that is interesting about all of this is that when the undercover officers were deployed, one thing that they are very much seeking to avoid is to be detected. But one thing that we do see from the inquiry is that actually activists often did uncover, rumble who the infiltrators were, and this is something that hinders the undercover officers. The threat of exposure is always a big worry for them. Also, the other thing that's interesting is that the exposure that comes out of their techniques, their methods, what they're doing in the inquiry also also hinders their operations. So the undercover officers, the whole police spying effort goes, flourishes in their terms in the dark. When it comes out into the open, that hinders them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Jason, yes, you may, yes.
About coming out into the open, and another one of these German parliamentary questions, I think it came out that the police are actually very worried that with social media and Facebook and all the social media profiles, today everyone knows from their friends, their kids, their grandkids, every kid has an Instagram account or whatever it is, and their face is on it. So there's so much common access to facial recognition software that the police have been saying for years, they're not going to be able to have undercover police for much longer, because they're worried that everybody that joins the ranks of the police as a kid or a teen or what have you, may have already put their real name and identity on their Facebook page, and activists can easily find it. So they're going to have to find other ways to infiltrate us, and they know it. And it's another way that we can shine light on their darkness. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm now going to pass on to Ray Street, who is a former chair of Greater Manchester District CND, still very much on the council for National CND, and Ray is going to, I was going to say finish us off, that sounds dreadful, but help us to come to the end of this webinar. Thank you, Ray. You need to unmute yourself, Ray, please.
That's it. Right. Can everyone hear me now? Yeah. Well, firstly, I want to say a big thank you to our contributors, and also thank you to our participants. But I want to acknowledge, really, because I've been so struck by it today, by the tenacity of Jason and Rob in continuing with these, and particularly Jason. Your life hasn't been easy, has it, Jason? And to keep going is wonderful, shining that light. And the same with Rob, you know. And you're not always welcome, I'm sure, Rob. Even in Guardian circles. I just had an experience with the Guardian of my letter being shortened. You could say censored. So it's a big thank you to all those people. And Jason, I would like you to pass on to, and Rob too, to all those brave, for example, the women who've come forward. It mustn't have been easy for them. And so, you know, there are people out here who do appreciate what they've done. We've heard today how from the 1920s, peace and social justice movements have been infiltrated and spied upon. Isn't it ironic that those people who advocate non-violence and speak against war or weapons of mass destruction or the arms trade are treated as though they are the dangerous terrorists? And of course, this goes on today, up to the present day. And I was thinking about, as somebody mentioned, Greater Manchester. We know ourselves in Greater Manchester CND that we were infiltrated. The thing is, I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, but somebody said that things had got more sophisticated, and obviously they had in the 80s, but it wasn't difficult to rumble this person. I mean, and what was interesting when you've been speaking as well, Jason, was that she freely admitted she'd been working in Northern Ireland. She didn't say that she was an undercover police person, but she just had a job in Northern, and she had connections in Northern Ireland, and she was a churchgoer, apparently. I don't know if that was to put us, you know, that she was a loyal member of the church. But it didn't take much to rumble what she was at. We could give you incidents of that. The same with another campaign I was in, which we started in Manchester, the campaign against depleted uranium weapons. That was, you know, and there we knew we had, so, I mean, they were so obvious. I don't understand that. I mean, a young man would come and take notes and say, he said it was for his thesis on war studies. And he'd make these elaborate notes and we'd wonder why. So, of course, we never discussed anything that we were going to do in front of, you know, any demonstration happening, whatever we were going to do. No, we didn't discuss it in front of him. And he disappeared into the blue, as did the young woman in Greater Manchester CND. We've never seen or heard of her since. Perhaps she's back in Northern Ireland. So it's quite interesting that sometimes they're not sophisticated, or is that deliberate? I don't know. Is it just to frighten you? I don't know. CND, as we've heard, is seeking a public inquiry to examine how undercover officers infiltrated their organisation at a time when it was challenging government policies. And CND, as you've heard from Rob, issued its demand after a judge-led public inquiry confirmed that police and undercover officer spied on a CND group in 85 and 86 and further on into the 2000s, as Rob said. The judge said at that time, and I like this, why did the police spy on CND and other peace protesters when they posed no serious threat to public order? Why indeed? And somebody's asked this question today. The police, of course, get their orders from government. And it seems to me that the establishment and the leaders of the military industrial complex, they play such a heavy part in our policies at the moment. They want to keep us quiet. Think of the new policing bill. Protest is a fundamental human right, and states have an obligation to facilitate protest, not suppress it. Yet this is what the government's police, crime, sentencing and courts bill seeks to achieve. Among other powers, the new bill will give police the choice on where, when and how people can protest, create new stop and search powers that will exacerbate discriminatory over-policing of people of colour. It will also extinguish, in a way, the right to strike for public sector workers. The police will also be able to take restrictive action against public assemblies, including those that cause, and this vague phrase, wonderful, they can use anything, can't they, for this, serious disruption to the life of the community. And this could be noisy or annoying. Well, that's the whole point about a protest, isn't it? That we want to be noisy and annoying. And I love the phrase that Ali told us that the Skinner lady had used. We've got to be clamorously, unceasingly to agitate. And that's what I would want to do. I loved it. And she was saying that back in the 1920s. We see also that not only from the government, Mark you, or the establishment, but from our main opposition political party, there are more and more authoritarian actions being taken to try to silence those standing for peace and social justice. I wish I didn't have to say that. Excuse me. We need to stand up to these oppressive moves and work together to maintain our democratic rights. As Jackie mentioned, this is the day for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. So I would urge any of you out there who are not in CND to join, because we're always stronger together as a movement than acting alone. And if, after what you have heard today, you would like Greater Manchester and District CND to organise a course on knowing your rights, do let us know, because we really would be pleased to do that. And as Jason said, we're going to keep on shining that light, Jason, because I, for one, even at my age, which is what my mother used to call a big age, so I always feel young in spirit, we will not be silenced. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our fantastic speakers. And please do support Jason's film. Please have a look. Go onto the website. I'm sure he's put the links up on the in the chat box. and keep following Rob in The Guardian. Watch this space, indeed. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
I'll keep buying The Guardian, Rob.
Thanks.